Good afternoon, my friends. This is Paul, and today I'm going to be reviewing to you Another Code Recollection for the Nintendo Switch. This is a collection of the two games in the Another Code franchise. Another Code 2 Memories, originally released on the DS, also known as Trace Memory in North America, and Another Code Journey into Lost Memories, originally released on the Wii. Unfortunately, it only came out in Japan and Europe, and as a result, for American audiences, this is going to be a brand new experience. Since these are remakes of these older games, I like to start out all of my reviews of remakes by talking about the list of changes made to the games, so that in case you already own the original game, or in this case games, you can decide if you want to buy the remake or not. In terms of the usual what do you call a new version of a game, I would say that this collection falls more into the reimagining camp, kind of like Final Fantasy VII Remake, where it completely redid the original games from the ground up so that in some cases they are unrecognizable. Both of the games now take place in full 3D. In the original Trace Memory, you would play from a top-down perspective on the bottom screen, and on the top screen you'd see a zoomed-in image of what Ashley was looking at, which were quite impressive for the time and were even somewhat photorealistic. Whereas now, everything is sort of this 3D cel-shaded approach. Honestly, I'm not the biggest fan of the graphical overhaul, and in many cases I actually think it looks worse than the original DS version. I've never been a big fan of cel shading, but somehow this is even worse than what Wind Waker did, because it seems like a lot of the textures are really basic and blurry, and a lot of the effects, such as leaves, they tend to crop into each other, and it's overall not a very good look. Some of the water effects are okay, and some of the character models are pretty decent. They do a good job of recreating the original cardboard cutouts from the original, but otherwise, I vastly prefer the more photorealistic stuff from the DS version, but I also understand that they were able to get away with that more because they were still images on the DS as opposed to having to fully animate them and having different camera angles and all that. That must have been pretty difficult. There are some additional help features, as Trace Memory was pretty hard at times, so this game features both a hint and a navigation assist system. You can press in on the control stick to have an arrow appear that tells you which direction to go in, and there will be a yellow marker where you're supposed to investigate or go next. So in other words, you never have to feel lost in the environments, and you can turn it on and off as much as you want. You can even toggle a setting in the options menu so that it's always on by default. And if that's not enough, there's also a hint system where you have three basic hints. There's the regular hint, which tells you this is what you should be doing right now. Then there's the detailed hint, which gives you more of like a subtle nudge as to what you're supposed to be doing next. And then finally there's the answer, which in some cases it feels less like an answer and more of just this is the solution to the way you're supposed to be doing it without outright giving it away. Like for example, they might say, this is the note that you're supposed to be reading, and this part of the note gives you the answer without actually giving the answer like they might in the Professor Layton series. I found this hint system to be a bit mixed, as sometimes I would know what I was supposed to be doing, but the game wasn't allowing me to do what I knew I should have been doing, so a lot of times the hint system felt a little bit redundant. Sometimes they helped, but for the most part I felt like it was just a matter of trying to get the game to register what I was trying to do. In the original game, Ashley had a device known as the DTS, the Dual Trace System. It was always the Dual Another system in Europe and America, and now everything has been renamed so that it's more faithful to those versions, because apparently American has always got to be the outlier. But now the DTS has been redesigned so that instead of being a standard model DS, it now looks like a Nintendo Switch, and it has more of a neon color palette. The puzzles have been completely overhauled from the ground up, and I know I've said that about most of the game so far, but I don't think they reused a single puzzle from Trace Memory. Some of the concepts remain, like in the original game, you had the ability to take pictures, which thankfully is still in this remake, and you can also even take selfies. You can't change Ashley's facial expression, but it is nice to be able to take selfies, as this is the age of the internet after all. And if you had two pictures, you could overlay one on top of another to get a better hint. And these made for some of the most creative puzzles in the original game. However, what made the original Trace Memory so special was that a lot of the puzzles were designed with the DS in mind, so they had really mind-blowing solutions. They took into account what would feel more realistic as opposed to what would feel more like a DS. So you would have touch resistance whenever Ashley would have to push something out of the way to simulate how an actual person would get tired upon pushing something, whereas a person simply pushing the stylus wouldn't feel as exhausted, or maybe using the two screens in a really clever way. Obviously, since this is a Switch game, some of those puzzles wouldn't have worked as well, so that's why they redesigned the puzzles from the ground up. And most of these are still pretty clever. I don't think any of them wowed me as much as the ones on the DS, but at the same time, I appreciate the commitment to redesign them so that they took more advantage of the Switch's horsepower, and if they didn't, the puzzles were just still fun to solve. Like, I still loved that aha moment I got upon completing a difficult puzzle, and a lot of them also make more use of camera angles. Like, if you look around your environment using the right stick, you might spot the solution, whereas the original game didn't have camera controls, so it was more about thinking outside the box, whereas in this, you have to look at every angle of the box. And so it provides a different kind of satisfaction, even if it's not completely as mind-blowing or revolutionary as the original games. To accommodate these new puzzles, most of the environments have also been completely overhauled so that they can take more advantage of the verticality that the Switch has to offer. So for instance, the mansion has multiple floors, and so that can make for better spatial awareness. The music has also been entirely remixed, a lot of times with real instruments too, and most of the time it sounds really well. They've also added brand new music to some scenarios, such as actually having a theme when you're solving the puzzles as opposed to the silence that you had in Trace Memory. And I've even heard that the game even brought in some music that was considered in the beta but never made it into the final game. There are a handful of new events added, and sometimes there have even been tweaks to the dialogue and story to, one, make it more faithful to the Japanese and European versions, but also just to make sure that the experience isn't a one-to-one exact recreation of the DS version. So for instance, Ashley is far less angsty and moody than she was in the original, and unfortunately some of the jokes that were added to the North American version have been removed for the sake of consistency across all regions. So for instance, the funny quip where you discover that the butler's name is Wells was removed because in the American version, Ashley said, "Isn't that the most butlerish sounding name ever?" There are now origami cranes in most of the rooms where if you aim the camera at it but not necessarily take a picture, you can get some journal entries. I won't say who wrote the journal entries because that might be a spoiler, but it can give you additional insight into the lore of the game's universe. This also promotes spatial awareness, as you really have to observe your environment carefully, as some of these cranes are really well hidden. You don't get penalized if you don't get all of them, thankfully, but it is nice if you just really want to know what was going on in the game that maybe the original game didn't answer. Now you might be wondering why I've only been talking about the Trace Memory portion of the remake so far, and that's because the game treats both games as though it's one seamless experience. So unlike other collections that I've reviewed, such as Sonic Origins or Super Mario 3D All-Stars, you can't just select which game you want to play. You start out with Trace Memory, and then you move into Journey of Lost Memories, which is kind of unfortunate, but at the same time it makes the story feel more grand and connected. Like some of the unanswered questions in Trace Memory get answered in Journey into Lost Memories, which is very nice, and it helps the game feel more complete. Now, since I've never played the Wii original, since it never came to North America, I can't comment as much on what's changed, so I looked up the Another Code wiki, and some of the changes that I saw were that the original game was in a 2.5D perspective, and now it has the full over-the-camera 3D that Trace Memory has, which works out significantly less well in that game, because I feel like the 2.5D was better suited, as there's a lot of backtracking in that game, and it can get really annoying to have to walk through these giant environments, and moving Ashley faster with the shoulder button does not actually make her go that much faster, so that made later portions of the game incredibly annoying, as the game felt like it was designed with that hallway perspective in mind, and yet the new engine did not make it any easier or smoother. I've also heard that they significantly changed quite a lot about the game's story and presentation. There are quite a few events that happened drastically differently than the original game. Some of the characters have been race swapped for the sake of diversity, I guess. Some names have been altered, and the characters wear different outfits. So for instance, Ashley now wears a red sweater and short shorts instead of pants and a sleeveless shirt. I think I've exhausted most of the major changes that aren't spoilers, so let's move on to the actual review. Again, to clarify, because you have to unlock Journey into Lost Memories, most of the rest of this review is going to be focusing on Trace Memories so as not to be considered spoilers. So the gist of the game is that you play as Ashley Robbins, who travels to Blood Edward Island to discover what happened to her father. And along the way, she meets a ghost named Dee, who is a little boy that died 57 years ago, and he has amnesia. So Ashley agrees that if he helps her find her dad, then she'll help him recover his memories. So it's like part mystery game and part puzzle, where you'll have to look for memory triggers that'll cause him to have flashbacks of his life, and if you get all of the memory triggers, then it helps you get the good ending, while at the same time you'll also have to solve puzzles to proceed through the mansion. As I've alluded to, most of the game takes place indoors, so I'm very thankful that there's now a courtyard in the mansion to break up the monotony. I would say that most of the game just involves, as you walk through the room, you'll see like little headings over each object. Like you might see a text bubble that says, oh, this is a desk. And if you press the A button, then you'll interact with it. And so you'll have to do a lot of opening drawers and cabinets. And then when a puzzle appears, you'll have to sometimes use the right item, or you might have to take advantage of the Switch's features to solve it. It feels a lot like the Professor Layton and Zero Escape style of games, without having the stifling difficulty level of those games. Very few of the puzzles did I ever feel like majorly stumped on, and if I was, the hints usually did a decent job of pointing me in the right direction. I never actually had to look up a walkthrough for any of the puzzles, which I feel like is both a blessing and a curse, as I think the hint system helps prevent players from needing to cross that threshold, while at the same time what made the original Trace Memory so great was that it was very hard, but yet if you knew how to look outside the box, it would make the puzzles more rewarding to solve, whereas this game just feels more like, oh, these are just hard puzzles, but not like overly hard. It was a lot of fun searching for the origami cranes. That was one thing that I really liked about this remake. And that satisfaction of solving a puzzle was still very much there and encouraged me to want to check out the rest of them. Now, of course, there's a story tying all of this together, and while Trace Memory's story is admittedly for the most part pretty simple, and there's a lot of connecting the dots that you have to do between certain events in Dee's past, like some things aren't explicitly spelled out and you kind of have to figure out, okay, I think I get what happened here, but the game doesn't explicitly tell you. But thankfully, once you get into Journey into Lost Memories, that's where a lot of the unanswered questions get answered, and it ends up being a really satisfying finale. I was originally tempted to give this game a very mixed score, but after I saw how everything came together, and after experiencing some really cool puzzles, I started to rethink my evaluation of this game. The original Trace Memory was a very 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10 type of game, depending on how I felt. It was really good, and I wished more people would play it, but it wasn't quite on the level of other DS masterpieces such as The World Ends With You or 999. I felt like it was one of those good but not great types of experiences. And while I think that this game still falls into that category, I think having Journey into Lost Memories as well helps make the experience so much better. However, there is one part of the second game that nearly made me give up on this collection, and I think it might make you want to give up as well, and that's that Journey into Lost Memories has quite a lot of puzzles where you have to do inputs that the game shows you, and some of those inputs involve rotating one of the control sticks, and these hardly ever worked. In fact, every time you fail an input, a giant error message appears on the screen, and then the inputs reset, and the inputs are randomized each time, so a lot of times I just had to hope for a selection of inputs that didn't involve rotating the control stick. I wish the game would have been more clear about what I was doing wrong, as I thought, okay, maybe in the hint section it'll say that I'm reading the hint wrong, but it just said, no, just rotate the right control stick, but it didn't tell me where to start the rotation or where to end it, so I think that might have just been a bug that the team overlooked. I also thought that there was a puzzle in the second game that involved moving something around. I won't tell you what the thing was in case that's a spoiler, but since the original game was on the Wii, I imagine that was originally a motion-controlled minigame, and it just did not work on the Switch. It felt like the controls were actively fighting me, and I just barely managed to solve the puzzle by just sheer frustration trying everything. And what made matters worse is if you crashed into something or went out of bounds, you'd have to start the whole puzzle all over again. So Journey into Lost Memories is definitely the weaker of the two in pretty much every way. It has inferior puzzles, it has infuriating puzzles, the environments are sometimes way too big, and the tonal shift is kind of jarring as well. Like, the original Trace Memory was quite the depressing game. Like, it had a nice payoff, but there wasn't a whole lot of happy stuff going on. There weren't a whole lot of jokes or whimsical moments. It was all about recovering what happened to a bunch of dead people and trying to figure out this gruesome mystery, whereas in the second game they tried so hard to go above and beyond to make you have more laughs that it almost became more unfunny because it was trying so hard. Well, at the same time, there was still a really deep and dark mystery going on, which was more fun to solve, but the in-between moments were more frustrating. Overall, I would say that Another Code Recollection was a great trip down memory lane, pun very much intended because memories are a huge part of this game's experience, while also introducing me to a sequel that I never thought I'd ever see the light of day. While Trace Memory was enjoyable to go through, and I'd probably play through it all again if I had the chance, especially as the post-game now lets you wear the retro shirt that Ashley wore in the original DS version, I don't think I'd ever replay the second game ever again, and I think I see now why it wasn't localized, because it didn't sell very well in Japan, and if the original game had just as frustrating of puzzles and backtracking, then yeah, I can see why it never came over. Although I do appreciate how it wrapped up a lot of loose ends from the original game and made things seem more conclusive. As far as both games as a whole, really the only major gripe I had is that the camera is way too close to Ashley. Oftentimes it feels like it's so close to her that it's about to jump her, and sometimes the camera kind of glitches out and like phases through her so that you're more in a first person perspective, and I wish I could zoom out way more times. It also made me feel kind of like a creep, because if I tried to look upward, which was often required for a lot of the puzzles, I would be staring up at Ashley's backside, which was not my intention. So if they had tweaked that one thing, I think the experience would have been significantly better. I think that you should probably rent this game, because you might want to stop after you finish the trace memory segment and maybe skip the journey into lost memories unless you're really curious about experiencing the additional story content and experiencing a quite mind-blowing twist ending. But the gameplay leading up to it is kind of frustrating and uneven, so it might make it only worth it if you go through a Let's Play. But I do think Trace Memory is still a great experience, especially as the puzzles are completely redone, so if you haven't played the DS version, then you're in for a real treat, as now you've got voice acting and better music and completely redone environments, but it also doesn't eliminate the DS version, as even if you play this and enjoy it, I would still recommend picking up the original game so that you can experience that game's puzzles and that game's environment. So you're essentially getting two different games, with the biggest similarity being the story and characters are the same, but just the way to get through the plot is very different. And it's very rare that a remake does something to that extent, and I really applaud the team for going that far. This is also $60, that's even more of a case of renting it, especially because the first half of the game is significantly better than the second. I also think $60 is just generally the type of price tag that I would only want to equate to games as massive as like Breath of the Wild, where they have so much content, whereas this is a big game, but it's only because it presents the two games as one, whereas I think something more like $40 would be more appropriate. Still, I liked the voice acting most of the time, music was pretty good, puzzles were amazing to solve even if they weren't as mind-blowing as the ones on the DS, and the story was pretty good. Not quite on the level of Zero Escape, but it had some neat twists once I went into the second game, and it was overall a blast to get to experience Ashley and Dee again and get to meet some of the new characters in the second game. But I wouldn't recommend picking it up at full price or buying it unless you really want Nintendo to make a third Another Code game. I would recommend renting it, getting as far as you want through the game, and then looking up the rest of the story on YouTube if you're really desperate to see how it plays out. So with that, thank you very much for watching. Let me know down in the comments what you think of the review, if you have any questions, if you've played the original Trace Memory, what are your experiences with it. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters, Matthew Rakowski, Spoon Ghost, and Splatcat, for helping me through some tough financial experiences. And until the next time, remember to keep the faith, stay epic, and God bless. Bye!